Alors, mesdames et messieurs, j'espère que vous avez eu une bonne pause lunch. Je vous invite à bien vouloir prendre place alors que j'invite Madame Dominique Lambert à venir nous présenter le premier panel de cet après-midi. Madame Lambert.
Bon, bonjour. Je voulais juste vous dire, je suis aussi sur le comité d'organisation de l'événement aujourd'hui, donc j'espère que vous passez une belle journée jusqu'à présent. La prochaine discussion présentée par Bereskin et Parr sera avec Todd Bailey, qui est directeur en propriété intellectuelle pour ScaleAI. Il est ingénieur, avocat, agent de brevet, agent de marque, 25 ans d'expérience à aider les entreprises à intégrer leur pays dans leur stratégie commerciale. Puis, il va vous parler un peu de la mission de ScaleAI. Et son interlocuteur aujourd'hui, Denis Kesseris, qui est associé au cabinet Bereskin et Parr à Montréal, membre du groupe de pratique technologique électrique et informatique, et 20 ans d'expérience en pays, en Europe et en Amérique du Nord. To you, Todd and Denis.
Merci, Dominique. Bon, bien, tout d'abord, Todd, merci d'avoir accepté de joindre à nous aujourd'hui pour partager ta perspective unique sur l'intelligence artificielle et l'API.
Merci, Denis. Je suis très heureux d'être ici aujourd'hui. Il y a beaucoup de choses intéressantes à discuter, donc let's go.
All right. So, before we get into a deeper discussion about AI and IP, can you tell us a little bit more about yourself and about what you do at ScaleAI?
Yeah, sure. Dominic gave a quick overview there. I'm by training an engineer, lawyer, patent and trademark agent, but I spent the last 20 years working on the business side of intellectual property, in business, building IP portfolios, using IP as a tool of business, working with engineers, hundreds of engineers and scientists and technologists, in that mission. And they've taught me a few things about intellectual property. They taught me that intellectual property is complicated. They taught me that intellectual property is boring. They taught me that intellectual property is irrelevant to business. And so, hearing that, it sort of gave me a mission that I wanted to try to make intellectual property, a little bit less complicated, hopefully a little bit less boring, but definitely more relevant, talk about it in a way that's more relevant to business. And so that's what I do. So now I'm the Chief IP Officer at ScaleAI. I work with SMEs, founders, entrepreneurs in AI to help them sort of see the relevance of intellectual property to their business. And so that's the world I work in. My comments today are sort of going to be with that. I know there's a variety of people in the audience, but that's sort of, what I do. ScaleAI is a federal supercluster. Okay, so ScaleAI is co-investing federal government money with industry into AI projects across Canada. We've invested in 100 projects in our first 5-year mandate. We're just starting our second 5-year mandate. We also support acceleration of AI startups in the supply chain sector. Talent upskilling we support as well. And we are, in our estimation, the only sort of transnational, Canada-wide player in the AI ecosystem in Canada. So part of our mission is to try to knit together the various ecosystems across Canada. And to that end, I'll just a quick commercial plug here. ScaleAI will be co-hosting here in Montreal in September an event called All In, which is a showcase of Canadian AI, Canadian-focused, of the companies that are working, the companies that are adopting, and so on. And so I'd invite you to come to the ScaleAI website, which is scaleai.ca, and check it out under the events section. So, Denis, that's kind of my MCU origin story. That's how I got here.
Excellent. Okay, so look, I've got my tough questions here.
Okay, good. There you go.
Let's start with relevance. So we often say AI has changed everything, right? And it's really hard to even keep up with the news of what's coming out. It's almost kind of on a daily basis, the ChatGPT stuff and what have you. From a business perspective, this has led to to new business and revenue models that are predicated on open innovation and the use of open source software. So if AI is on the leading edge of these changes towards a more kind of open world, why should we care about IP?
You know, I like the question about why. I mean, this is what Simon Sinek tells us to start with why, right? Like it's the right place to start, because if you don't get the why, then the rest doesn't matter, right? And so you're absolutely right. The economy is changing, right? 25 years ago, the economy was much more about stuff, you know, disk drives, Blackberries, things like that, right? But now the economy is about ideas, information, and data, right? That's what the economy is about. But we still have these notions of intellectual property that are rooted in the technology of 25 years ago, of the hardware paradigm for intellectual property. And so, like, if I was to ask, you know, sort of the average entrepreneur, or perhaps someone in this room, you know, what's intellectual property for? The kinds of answers you usually get are stopping somebody from doing something, right? And that's one use case in intellectual property, but there's so many other ways that intellectual property can be used. And so if you were to ask me what intellectual property is about, it's about leveraging the commercial value in ideas, information, and data, right? That's how I see intellectual property. So IP is ideas, information, and data. That's what intellectual property is. And the economy is all about ideas, information, and data. So the two of those, like, we should be seeing intellectual property as more and more relevant, and yet we're not, right? And it comes from this perspective that we're taking on intellectual property. But if you look at the leveraging the value, that's not just about stopping people. Maybe that generates value, I don't know. But there are a lot of other ways to leverage value using IP tools like patents and copyrights and trademarks and so on and so forth. But it's really about this focus on the business value that can be generated and the tailwinds towards meeting business objectives, right? So, you know, really we should care about intellectual property because it's at the heart of the economy. We have an intellectual property economy right now. And, you know, we just need to sort of challenge ourselves on these ideas about IP and whether they're caught up with the times or not.
Right. Okay. So it's not all about patents and lawsuits and that kind of rough stuff, which I guess is a bit of an old-fashioned view. What's a better way of thinking about intellectual property in a modern economy?
I wouldn't say that it's old-fashioned, but to say that that's 100% of the equation is what I'm challenging.
Yeah.
But, you know, I think a new way starts sort of untangling the terms, especially for people who are not, you know, IP professionals. So I explained that intellectual property at its heart, in my view, is just ideas, information, and data, right? So ideas like new business models, new use cases, ways to solve problems. Information like computer code, of course, AI models, these are essentially information at their heart, and data, like proprietary data. You know, so that's intellectual property. But if that's intellectual property, what are these things over here? Patents and copyrights and things like that. Now, there are obviously legal rights that can be used to leverage the intellectual property. And so they're called IP rights, but I like to call them IP tools, because you have a toolbox of different tools that you can use to generate this commercial value, to leverage this commercial value. And depending on what your objectives are, you're going to choose the appropriate tool for the job. So, you know, if we step back and say, what is AI all about? What are AI businesses all about? They are using their ideas, their information, and their data, their IP, to attract customers, to build things for customers, to gain traction, to grow, essentially, right? And so every AI business, in fact, most tech businesses are essentially intellectual property businesses, right? That's what they use. That's what's at their core. That's how they generate value, right? So everybody that has a business essentially these days has an intellectual property business, and they need to start to see it that way, right? But if you have an intellectual property business, there's sort of two ways that you can manage that business. And to sort of explain that, I'll put AI aside for a second, and we'll just imagine a road sort of outside of town here that has a couple of farmers on it, across the street from each other. And on one side, you have Farmer Joe, and out behind his house, he has a field of wheat. And when Farmer Joe needs money, Farmer Joe goes out, cuts some wheat, and brings it back in, and he sells that wheat, right? And that's pretty much what he does. Sometimes he goes out, the wheat's a little bit dry. Sometimes it's got some disease. Sometimes the goats have been eating it, but he just cuts what he needs, and he goes back in. Across the street, we have Farmer Jane. Jane is out there in the springtime planting her wheat. She's watering her wheat. She's making sure it's not sick. She wants to separate her wheat from the neighbors. She has a nice fence around her property. And she's also actually watching the weather to see what's going to happen next week, because maybe she needs to cut her wheat this week and bring it in to protect it from what's coming down the road. So the wheat is the resource that these farmers are using to drive their business. And the analogy is obviously that the intellectual property that's the resource of tech companies like AI and other digital businesses, they need to understand that their intellectual property is a resource that they need to manage. And they can either manage it like Farmer Joe and just hope that it's there when they need it, or they can be methodical about it like Farmer Jane and recognize the resource, nurture the resource, try to grow the resource, and make sure that it's there when they need it, right? But, to your question, I mean, IP, because IP is essentially the resource that our businesses are using these days, this is like, it's more relevant than ever that they understand that and understand how to sort of manage and leverage that in their business, because we need to update the way that we're looking at intellectual property to give these people the tools that they need to go and do what they need to do.
That makes a lot of sense. But just coming back, and I don't want to labor the point, but just coming back to this idea that AI today is really built on open research, collaborative research, and open source. How does that fit in to your view of IP?
Well, I appreciate you keeping my feet to the fire on that, because I tried to dodge it, but let me deal with it head on. Open research has really been important to AI, right? But is everybody publishing everything? Does nobody have anything proprietary anymore? Are they all is all data available on the internet for everybody? No, right? Businesses still have their secrets. They still have their proprietary technology. They still have the things that they are doing to protect their competitive edge. And open research hasn't changed any of that, right? It's just a tool, a new way of sharing knowledge, just like the internet was 20 years before that. But in fact, that was the enabler. But the point is that open research hasn't really changed anything. Open source, on the other hand, open source software, on the other hand, has been also really important to getting AI to where it is today. And it has changed something, because what it's brought, I mean, it started out as sort of like, some hippies wanted to share their software with the world, but what it's turned into is an intellectual property tool, right, in that toolbox that you can use to leverage the value of code, right? Rather than keeping something proprietary and trying to sell subscriptions to it, you make it available, and you use that with a business purpose in mind, either to drive traffic to your platform, or perhaps an adjacent product or service, or some other business model. And there's new business models built on open source every day. But open source is an IP tool, right? And so it is changing the paradigm, and it is opening up sort of, our view of what intellectual property is today, versus, and it's not really applicable to hardware that much anyway, right? So it's part of how we're sort of modernizing, what IP is all about these days. So, but everything really comes back to managing that resource and then, trying to grow the resource that you have.
So what would be the takeaway as to why an AI company should care about IP? What's the one thing that they should take away from today?
It's this point that I raised that, I really sort of like get people by the lapels and sort of say to them, like, you got to understand that you are operating an intellectual property business. That's what you are using. That's your resource, right? And so, you have to recognize that. And then from there, you can make the decision. Okay, I like Farmer Joe. I just want to go and cut the wheat and sell it when it's time and go back to doing what I'm doing. Or I want to be more methodical about this, right? So, this is like essentially the takeaway that if you remember one thing from this whole day today, it's that technology business today, especially software and AI, it's all about the IP. That's their key resource. So that's why it's relevant.
So there's clearly an impact on IP. Clearly has an impact on the development of AI. What are the issues that you see driving this in your experience? Like, in other words, what issues are you seeing AI companies here in Canada and perhaps even here in Montreal handle well and perhaps not so well in some instances?
Yeah, listen, I mean, you mentioned like all the really cool things that are going on in AI right now with ChatGPT, generative AI, stable diffusion, all this sort of stuff. And so I'm sure people here are saying, did I come to like the wrong session? This guy's up here talking about farming, right? Like what's going on, right? The problem is that intellectual property is abstract, right? And the more you can visualize that, the better, right? So with hardware, you had something in your hand and you could look at it and say, there's my IP, right? But when you start to get into AI and software, it's like, what is this thing that I'm dealing with, right? So it's more complex. And so it's even more important than ever that we can't use some of these shortcuts we used to use with intellectual property and hardware. We have to go back to first principles and say, like, what is it that I'm trying to do here, right? So we could talk about fancy AI strategies for IP and stuff like that, but if you don't have that foundation of a good solid foundation of understanding what your intellectual property is and what the objectives that you're trying to reach, to me that's like building a fancy penthouse on top of a building that's sinking into the mud, right? Like that's not useful, right? You want a nice, strong, boring foundation. And so when I talk about foundations to entrepreneurs and startups, I tell them that process starts not by looking out in the world, but by looking inside, looking inward. What intellectual property do you have? And specifically, the ideas, information, and data that you have that's moving the needle on your business objectives, on driving customers to your platform, on growing your business, that sort of thing, right? I call that IP self-awareness, right? They need to be aware of what they have and what specifically is driving things, okay? Because if you don't know that, then everything else you do is sort of, you're faking it. You don't have that solid foundation, right? So the way I explain it is if you imagine an equilateral triangle, and at the top you have IP ownership, on the left side you have the right to use IP or the ability to use IP, and on the left side, on the right side you have the leveraging or protecting of intellectual property. And these are the three IP issues that touch every company, right? So ownership is at the top because it's the most important issue. If you don't own the intellectual property that you're doing business with, then you don't need to worry about anything else, right? And so, ownership's really important, right? Obviously, but if we think again about Farmer Jane and Farmer Joe, like Joe just cuts the weeds, he doesn't even know if it's his, whereas Jane she's got a fence around, she knows what's hers. If you want to talk about valuing those businesses, the valuation of those businesses, if you don't own the intellectual property that you're using in your business, that's obviously going to affect not only your ability to keep doing business, but the valuation of your business as well. So it's a really important, thing to get a handle on. And the thing that sort of lay people get wrong every single time about IP ownership is that it does not follow the money. When you pay, if you're creating something for me and I pay you for it, I don't get the intellectual property automatically. It stays with you. It stays with the creator. And although there's all these sort of different legal situations that can pop up, the essential thing is to know is that whoever you're doing business, whether it's your founders, your employees, your consultants, your contractors, your customers, your vendors, you need to have that IP ownership. That's like your foundation. This is the boring stuff that you need to have right to start with, right? And so it really comes back to, making sure your contracts have IP ownership, but even before that, you have to look at this process of IP self-awareness to figure out what you need to own. Because you don't need to own everything, but you do need to own key stuff, key things.
Fair enough. So, establishing who owns IP is obviously, one of these issues where an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. How about the flip side? How about, trying to convince investors and partners that there are no barriers, IP barriers, to successfully commercializing your tech.
Yeah.
You know, in other words, how do you navigate rights that might be asserted against you?
Right, and that's, you know, the next part of the triangle, which is the right to use, right? So your ability to, you know, can you do what you want to do without being affected by other people's intellectual property? Because you can be Farmer Joe and if you want, and ignore your own intellectual property, but you're not allowed to ignore everyone else's. The world doesn't work like that. So you at least need to, there's certain issues you need to be concerned about. In AI, there's 4 issues that I flag for companies. The use of confidential information, the use of training data, the use of open source, and other people's patents. So, you know, quickly on confidential information, the big risk is always what your new employees are bringing from their last employer. And it's super, super important to establish a culture, establish policies in your company that people understand that they're not to be using the information that belonged to their last employer, right? Because that's just sort of like a disease in your company that you can't afford to have. So, you know, strong culture is really important. When it comes to training data, there's sort of 4 categories of sort of questionable training data that can show up. So, you know, one of the ones that's in the news right now is sort of when you're using copyrighted data that belongs to other people. So whether you're talking about, you know, GitHub Copilot, or Midjourney, or, you know, Stable Diffusion, or any of these sorts of platforms that were trained on copyrighted and sometimes patented data, well, not patented data, excuse me, but copyrighted data of other people, images, code, whatever. And this is being sort of fought out in the courts right now in the US, and I'm sure it's going to be a little bit different in each country. But, you know, this is a foundation that's maybe sort of built on the edge of swampland, right? Web scraping is another data problem. You know, scraping data from the web, it's been established for quite some time that scraping data from websites is probably not okay, counter to the terms of the website terms of use and that sort of thing. Another tricky area is personal information and health information, right? And everybody understands sort of the privacy framework in that, but where the tricks come is that you acquired that data actually legitimately in the first instance for, you know, either because you were serving that customer or you know, a patient in a healthcare situation. But then you say, hey, we got all this great data, let's build a model to do X, Y, Z. And you may not have that consent, right? The consent that you need needs to cover the second and third and fourth things that you want to do, and that can be a little tricky sometimes too. And then the 4th area with data, training data, is machine data. So in the manufacturing machines or IoT devices, that sort of thing, quite often the data that those things generate belongs to the manufacturer of those devices, and you may not have the right to go and use that in your AI. So, you know, all of that is to say is that there can be these sort of questionable sources of data and whether you have the right to use it. But what almost every startup and even big company, the mistake they will make is, who's going to find out, right? Who's going to find out that I used this data that I wasn't supposed to use, right? And what I say to them is there's 2 people that are for sure going to find out, and they're the 2 people that you care about the most. That is your investors, right? Because they're going to ask you, where did your data from, and are you allowed to use it? And if you are, you know, looking for an exit someday, your buyer is definitely going to ask you that. Where did that come from, right? And there's many a deal that cratered when the wrong answer came to those questions, right? So this is about building a foundation that's strong, that can support all of the other things that you build on top, okay? So that's training data. Moving on to open source is another sort of right to use issue, using open source. And the reason is that, you know, open source is actually still owned by someone else, and it's still copyrighted and sometimes patented. And, you know, it has, the only reason that you get to use this open source, and this shocks a lot of people, but it's because of the license, right? It's because of the license. Yes, you can use it for free. Yes, you can use it for whatever you want, but there is a list of obligations, either short or long, in that license that you need to abide by. And if you are not aware of those issues, and if you are not managing those issues, you could be facing down the wrong end of a problem. And again, the same 2 people are going to ask you those questions, and the same 2 people are going to care what the answer is. And so it's really important for companies to understand that when they use open source, that they're using the right kind of open source in the right kind of way for whatever their objectives are. The last one is patents, which of course is a little bit different issue, but the way I describe it is just like imagine yourself, you're steaming down the road towards your business objective, but there's a complete roadblock. There's someone's patent that's a complete roadblock. Because, yeah, there's hundreds of thousands of patents out there, and you could spend the rest of our natural lives searching for patents, but the reality is if there's one out there that's your roadblock, you should find it, right? And that's not so easy. Usually you can't do that by yourself. We need an expert like yourself to help out. And when it comes to cost, the good thing is that there is some government support that's available to SMEs, to startups, to help offset those costs in the IRAP IP Assist program. And I know you work a lot in that area, and I just thought maybe you could expand a little bit on what that IP Assist program looks like.
Yeah, IRAP IP Assist is actually generally, it's quite a new program, but it's quite good. There are 3 levels. It's kind of a progressive thing where SMEs can engage with someone like me to essentially get those foundational aspects of their position right. Getting the agreements in place, making sure there's a bit of freedom to operate analysis in there, and kind of by the end of the process, that 3rd level, SMEs should be in a position to have a little bit of a plan, or at least the outline of a plan for addressing their IP position. And it really is, I think, the whole genesis of it. The idea of it was to address this issue that in Canada there are a lot of SMEs that kind of had, they've had IP on their to-do list for a long time, but they're not quite sure where to start, what to do, and that's the kind of starter program, which is really quite good.
Yeah, I've heard great things about the program. I think a lot of people who are engaging with the IP that would not have done otherwise. So I think that's fantastic.
Yeah. Okay, so let's put risk management and mitigation aside for a minute, and it, it's obviously critical and it's an important piece, but let's face it, businesses are built on providing value, right? And not on the avoidance of risk. So how does IP provide real business value to an AI company?
Right. So going back to my little triangle, that's the last vertex there, which is, leveraging intellectual property. And if you think about leveraging, like, as a word, what does that mean? It sort of means, like, the action of sort of multiplying the effect of something, right? And so, I like to use that word leverage with intellectual property. Certainly it's not my word, but the problem with protecting intellectual property is it's not a natural instinct in business, right? There's very few businesses that are in protection business, outside of cybersecurity and Brink's armored cars. So, leveraging, it seems like a more sort of business type word, right? So, the main tools that get used in AI, of course, are secrets, patents, open source, and trademarks. And I always start the conversation with trademarks because the name and the brand of the company, it's like your identity, right? It's like everything, right? And just think about how devastating it would be to have another company set up shop using the similar name or the same name and having your customers being confused and going to the wrong company, right? Yeah. So, that's the mistake that everyone makes is that when they filled out that little form to start their company, or their lawyer filled out that form and they wrote the name in the box, that felt like they were writing it in stone, but that has like zero protection for your brand and for your name. And the only thing that will help you is a registered trademark. And in the countries that you're doing business, for Canadian, it's at least Canada and US. And if you don't have this, you're just signaling to everybody you talk about your business that you're not serious. You're not serious about your business. You don't know that this is like absolute ground level. You've got to have a registered trademark for your name and your brand.
Okay, so trademarks are important. This receptacle for goodwill, and you're right. Identity is everything, right? Company's identity. But so what? After that, what's next?
Well, the biggest thing in AI is secrets, right? Like everybody says they're keeping their AI secret, right? And that's not a bad strategy when you think about it. The AI is sitting somewhere on a cloud behind a firewall. It's not really, there's not much that's exposed to the world. But you know, what I really underline with companies is there's two things they need to know about protecting secrets. And the first is that the legal protection is super, super weak. Like, there's essentially no legal protection for secrets. I know we can rhyme off what the law says about protecting secrets, but in reality, you know, that's not a realistic situation. So the only protection you're getting for secrets is that protection that you yourself are giving, right? Like, think high school. If you don't want somebody to know something, don't tell them, right? The second thing that I tell them is that the risks are not foreign state actor hackers, whatever we call those people. And it's not competitors trying to steal from you. The risk to your secrets is right here. The risk is right here from you telling people that you should not be telling your secrets to. And most people would say, wow, I didn't talk to my competitor. Yeah, but who does talk to your competitor? Your customer and your vendors, right? So when you go into a customer meeting and you start telling them all the great stuff you're doing, customers sometimes become competitors themselves when they decide to hire their own data science team and just solve the problem themselves using the information you gave them, right? So I really encourage companies to, when they're talking to customers, to actually put themselves in the customer's shoes. The customer doesn't need to build the solution. They want to know what the benefits are, what the advantages are. They want to see the use cases. They want to see a working sort of prototype, something like that. This is what they need to hear. And if you do that, you're also going to be doing yourself a favor and protecting your secrets. But before that, even, you need this IP self-awareness. What are my secrets? What am I trying to keep secret? Because when I ask that question, the sound of crickets is deafening, right? They have everything. I'm protecting everything. You can't protect everything. It's not possible unless you never talk to anybody. And boy, these guys like to talk. So you need to know, what are your secrets? What do you need to protect? Who you need to protect them from? And if you don't know that, you're not actually protecting secrets, okay? So IP self-awareness is critical. It's that critical first step. And even under NDA, then it's always, you know, the need to know. And with data, it's all the same things. Don't let it out of your possession. Keep it encrypted, you know, all that sort of stuff. But, you know, in principle, as I said, secrets are actually a great way to protect AI because it's not otherwise, you know, it's not otherwise available. It's not otherwise out there. And you can keep it if you kind of keep these basic things. The reason that, one of the reasons that secrets are such a big draw is because they seem free, right? You don't have to pay an expert like yourself to keep secrets. And the reason I say it seems free is there is a cost, because nothing's free. But that cost comes in the form of daily effort and discipline to actually protect those secrets. And that's like one of the hardest things to do, right? Heaven forbid you ever have to sue anybody, because that's extremely expensive as well, right? But up front, yes, it's cheap, but you need to have the discipline. You need to understand what you're protecting and go ahead and do it.
Yeah, so a bit of self-help required there in terms of kind of step one, figuring out what you want to keep secret, and then figuring out how to keep it secret. So I guess finally, what about the one that gets everybody excited, patents?
Yeah. Listen, I've already, you know, sort of shown my hand a little bit on that one, the difference between AI patenting and the difference between hardware patenting. But, you know, just come back to that. You have a piece of hardware in your hand, right? And you can see your intellectual property, but you can also see the risk to it, because when I put it out into the public, I get the risk, right? My competitor is going to get it, take the lid off, and look inside as well, right? So the risk, it's obvious to me what the risk is to my intellectual property, and the logic that leads you to patenting is sort of like 101, right? This is kindergarten stuff. But when it comes to AI and software in general, I would say, you're not putting anything usually out into, you know, especially with, you know, service models, software as a service type models. All you're putting out is an interface. That's it, right? The rest is sitting on a server somewhere. Probably there's 5 different ways to do it anyway. So if you patented yours, you're still, you know, not moving the needle. So, like, do we just forget about patents for AI? And what I say is, again, we have to go back to first principles. In AI, AI is not only harder on the math and science side, it's harder on the intellectual property side because we have to go back to first principles. We have to say two questions I always ask, is why do you want a patent? And then what is it that you could patent that will get you that objective, right? So you have to start with why. And the reason why sort of decides everything else. And what people are shocked by is that not all patents are the same. I got a patent, my patent's as good as your patent, right? Because they see the description in there, that, there's a description of the invention, a very detailed description with figures and numbers and all kinds of foreign languages. Well, it's all English, but it still looks foreign. And they think, great, and that all publishes long before you know if you get a patent or not. And they see, great, my invention's protected. And I say, no, it's not. Because out of that description, you now have to pick one thing, and you get one sentence to describe that one thing, and that's your claim. I'm simplifying a little bit, but that's essentially how it works, right? You have to pick one thing, and you get one sentence to describe it. And if once you have that sentence, you could think of it kind of like a recipe maybe, with ingredients, right? You got 10 ingredients in your recipe sentence, and if someone comes along and uses all 10 of those ingredients, they're going to be infringing your patent. But if they take one ingredient out or switch it for something else, they're probably going to avoid your patent. So if you don't have a very clear idea of why you want that patent, that's going to inform you, the why informs you on what your sentence should say, your list of ingredients, right? You need to really have a clear idea about why you want that patent if all those moving parts are going to work. It's not just spewing a description into a patent application that protects you. It's not at all. So when it comes to the why, there's kind of three buckets of whys that patenting in AI makes sense. One is to crystallize the value of the ideas. Another one's to grow the business, and the third one is to grow an image. So the first one, crystallize. This is actually, the way you were describing it to me a couple of weeks ago, crystallizing the value in the idea. And I love that concept because it's kind of like there's this idea that's there, and you give it like a solid form. You're giving it a shape. You're giving it something concrete, right? And the way that I sort of explain that is, with my farmers, my favorite farmers there. Farmer Joe has some weed out in the field that sort of represents a future value of something if he goes and gets it, right? But remember, Farmer Jane saw that storm coming, and she cut her wheat, and she cleaned it, and it's sitting in the silo now, and it's ready to be loaded onto a truck, and she's ready to get paid for that, right? She crystallized the value, that future value of the wheat, and turned it into something now that she can actually, an asset that she can deal with. And that's what patenting does for ideas, information, and data, right? It crystallizes it, it prepares it into something that is now a useful asset, right? So, and when it comes to things like investors or, getting bought, like an acquisition, these are things that quite often the buyer is not only looking for technology, but looking for like patented technology, right? So, that can be a critical thing. Growing the business is another reason you might patent. Licensing is sort of an obvious one if you have sort of adjacent use cases or something like that you're not exploiting that you may want to have someone else do and pay you for. The other sort of part of growth is where I call preserving your ability to grow if you get sued with someone else's patent, right? If you have something to hit back with, you can have that situation where you sort of even the playing field and sort of balance the discussion around how to settle that situation, right? When it comes to growing an image, when startups file patents, one of the very first things they do, of course, is issue a press release. Hey, look, we're not only doing interesting things, but they must be really smart because we filed a patent for them, right? So, and why not, right? Like that's a great way to build your technical credibility. The other thing it also does is customers like patents. Customers like to get stuff that they can only get from one place, right? I don't know how many businesses I've dealt with that file patents just to call their product patented, right? Because they know in their markets that customers will like that must be good because it's patented. It has to be great technology, right? So there's this whole sort of image around patenting. But the important thing is that patents cost money, they cost time, they cost effort, and there's that strategic cost of everything being published. So you really you want to make sure that you know why and that you're pursuing the right path to get that why. So
excellent. There's a lot of moving parts, right? It seems to me, I follow the progression of AI companies in Canada quite closely, and you see them rise and fall. And in your view, how is it that some companies are able to manage all of these moving parts in a way to build business value, and others just seem to not be able to?
Listen, it's of course it's a lot of luck. It's a lot of timing. But on the intellectual property side, it's also luck and timing, right? Because Farmer Joe may never have a problem. The wheat may always be there, and he's always able to sell it. And he may be laughing down his nose at Farmer Jane, who's working so hard, right? But the problem is business is so difficult for businesses that anything you can do to improve your odds is boding well for your future, right? Anything that you can slightly tilt the field in your favor, when the going gets tough, you maybe have better options than Farmer Joe does, okay? On IP strategy, is part of that. People get super confused about what IP strategy is. So the way I just explain it is it's just like it's part of your business plan. And this is the part where you take the important intellectual property that you discovered during this sort of self-awareness phase, you linked it with some kind of objective that it's related to, and you sort of have the steps of how you're connecting those two, whether it's through filing a patent or keeping secrets, what kind of secret from who, that sort of thing. It's just where you're planning all that stuff, because nothing happens in business without a plan, right? So this part of your intellectual property is just like, what's your important IP, and what are you doing to optimize the benefits? And that's really at its heart. And the really important thing for startups and SMEs to understand is that this is a measure of their maturity. Investors come in and they want to know, do you have an IP strategy? If you say no, you're like down here. You're like, if you have an IP strategy, if you know what these words mean, if you're able to explain it, they don't really measure how good your strategy is. They're measuring sort of your conviction that you're in that strategy. So, it's an interesting sort of dynamic.
You have some examples, like real-world examples of well-executed strategy that kind of promotes growth or facilitates financing, commercialization, valuation, that type of thing?
Yeah, there's a few that I think are sort of demonstrative of what I think are sort of like first principle IP thinking, okay? And the one I get asked all the time about this is like, why do you say patents are good when Elon Musk says patents are no good, right? Tesla quit patenting years ago, right? And so I have to sort of, for those of us, that may not be aware, about 10 years ago, Tesla pledged that anybody who wanted to use their patents in the electric vehicle field was entitled to do so for free. They didn't have to ask for permission. So the first thing you need to understand is Tesla did not abandon or cancel their patents. They did not give up on patenting. In fact, they've tripled their patenting, the rate at which they patent since then. And more than half the patents they're filing now are software and AI, okay? The car is just a platform for software and AI, right? And so why did they do this then? Why did they make their patent? Well, Tesla has a dominant position in the electric vehicle market. Their competitor, by Elon's own tweets, is the gasoline engine, right? So if you're looking to grow the market and you have a dominant position in that market, the more entrants into that market that you can have, the better off you're going to do. And so this is a use of patents to leverage the commercial value in that business, right? My grandfather used to say you can attract more bees with honey than with vinegar, right? So they're using the patents to build and to grow the business, right? They're not stopping anybody from anything, right? Other than maybe using the patents outside of the field. But the point is that this is a different way to use patents. He didn't invent it, but he certainly made it popular and made a lot of people misunderstand what he was doing, right? There's another example is what's called the Microsoft Azure IP advantage. So Azure is the cloud, the Microsoft cloud product. And they have this promise that if you are an Azure customer, then they will not sue you on any of their patents. You don't have to worry about for the implementation you have on the Azure cloud. But beyond that, the interesting one from my perspective is that they will actually lend you their patents. If you're sued for infringement by someone else, they will lend you some of their patents to help you defend yourself, right? So now they're using, again, more like honey than vinegar, right? They're using the patents as a way of attracting business to the platform. And good on them. Like people are sort of like understanding now that patents are not always just about stopping things, right? And those are big company examples, right? Like small companies, you have to have a sizable portfolio to execute on strategies like that. But smaller, companies, like I was talking to an AI founder a few months ago who had an exit within the last year or so. And he said to me, we filed some patents, in that startup. And I didn't really know why I was filing those patents. We just did it because my advisors said that we should do it. And, so we filed them. And I was sort of surprised to see during the acquisition that the buyer was really interested in those patents. And he said, I had no idea. And in fact, he said, I think it actually helped us do a little better. And said, so, I'm already working on my next startup, and we're already planning sort of what our next patents are going to be, because I've seen it now firsthand, what that looks like, right? So we're getting a little bit short. I'll just get one more quick one in, is another founder story from here in Montreal. Had an exit. This one was a bit bigger, and it was a couple years ago, but he was explaining his strategy. Their strategy was, their AI, protected as secret, it's on the cloud, no one's going to see it. There's probably 5 other ways to generate those predictions with other AI techniques anyway. But their interface with their customers was what the customers really liked, what was attracting customers to their platform. And that's where they filed a few patents around that. And again, in the acquisition process, the buyer was extremely interested in those patents. And that was the sort of leverage that they were looking for with this transaction, right? Because for buyers, it's always sort of a make versus buy decision. Why don't I just do this myself instead of buying this startup, right? So that's sort of like, this is sort of like an IP strategy we would imagine, but it's these are real things happening in real companies. So, those are some examples.
Excellent. Thanks for that, Todd. Before I give you, are you okay to take a few questions from the audience?
Easy ones. I don't want anything hard.
If there are any questions.
Yeah.
But first, look, thank you for your time. Is there any final word that you'd like to?
Yeah, listen, what I say to people is like, we've just been talking for 45 minutes. And okay, I talked a little bit about farming and a little bit of construction. But I didn't talk about almost anything legal, right? We did not dive into legal rabbit holes on anything, right? Because intellectual property is a business subject. It's a business tool, right? Yeah, there's a legal framework in the background, just like there is for just about every business topic there is, right? But it's about optimizing the commercial value of ideas, information, and data. And that's really once you push people over that hurdle out of the I need a legal expert here. You do need a legal expert, but not on this strategy set, not understanding, not on that inward focus to find where your intellectual property is. So, in 2023, you have to have IP thinking sort of embedded in the way that you think about your business. It has to be part of the business process and not just something that you punt to your IP professional, right? So that's kind of the message that I always like to leave with people. And if anybody's sort of didn't already have enough of what I had to say, I welcome you to reach out to me on LinkedIn, and I post a blog there. And there's also on the ScaleAI website, there's some IP resources there that are available in both languages.
Thank you very much. Thanks for your time.
Thanks.
Mesdames et messieurs, un grand merci. Well, thank you a lot. I'm going to invite you to go out of stage because we don't have time for maybe one question, just one.
An easy
But
one.
you have to be quick. Okay, run. Did you hear?
Yeah, I
Okay,
can hear.
perfect.
So I'll just repeat the question is, we talked about a few other IP tools, but I didn't talk too much about copyright. In terms of, so typically with software, we think of software as being copyrighted. And that was a big deal, in my opinion, back when we had sort of desktop applications and there was actually a distribution of software, right? More and more, in fact, almost exclusively now, software is software as a service, it's called, right? You do use this every day on your phone, on your computer, and so on, where almost 100% of the code is running sort of in the background on a server somewhere. And so, in my opinion anyway, copyright does not really, it's not a strong tool that people rely on for protecting AI and things like that, because they're not usually exposing the code in a way that would be available for sort of cut and paste copying, as how I describe it. It causes a bit of a problem because a lot of, especially computer code type people, developers, sort of have this notion that copyright is this powerful protection that they have. And I think, again, this is an old idea, I think, coming back from how we used to do software. And they're like, I don't need patents, I don't need anything, I have copyright. And I'm like, you don't really have like, unless you're exposing your code to that cut and paste type copying, copyright doesn't really have a lot of protection for you in the AI part. You may have copyright, around your interface or that sort of thing, that how you're interacting, but it's really sort of on the margins. Copyright actually rears its head again on the training data side, as I mentioned, where you're using data that's copyrighted without permission of the copyright holder. And there's a raging debate, or the beginning of a raging debate going on in the US, whether that's fair use or not. I ultimately think, though, that those cases will all fail because they'll be they're scraped data, right? So there'll be website terms of use issues as well. So,
Mr. Belli, thank
Okay.
you for the answer. Do you going to be with us for the cocktail hour?
yes, for sure.
Then if you have more questions, vous avez plus de questions, no time for other questions. Mais M. Belli va être là ce soir de 5h jusqu'à 7h, donc pour notre cocktail hours, donc il va pouvoir répondre à plus de questions. Dennis, merci beaucoup pour la conversation. Todd Belli,
Merci.
thank you a lot.
Merci.